Rachel Miller stayed after the Sunday service because staying busy was easier than going home to an empty kitchen and a husband who worked late, so she stacked him books fast, moving row to row while the last notes of the organ faded and the old church settled into quiet, the kind of quiet that made her thoughts loud, and as she reached the front pew she felt the weight of her life press in. 38 years old, 14 years married, known by everyone as kind and dependable, yet carrying a tired ache she never spoke about, an ache that had grown slowly over years of polite dinners and missed conversations, and while she told herself she was just tired she knew it was more than that, because the silence at home felt heavier each week. The church smelled of wood and candle wax, sunlight slipping through stained glass and coloring the floor, and that calm should have soothed her, but instead her heart beat fast as if it knew something was about to shift, and when Pastor Daniel Brooks entered the room quietly she did not hear his steps, only his voice behind her saying her name in a gentle tone that made her pause, not from fear but from surprise, because no one said her name like that anymore, not with warmth, not with care. Daniel was respected, steady, the kind of man people trusted with their worries, and Rachel had always seen him as safe and distant, yet as he stood close behind her, not touching, not crossing a line, she felt aware of him in a way that unsettled her, and he spoke about the service, then about the choir, then about her help at the church, and his words were kind but personal, telling her she carried more than most people realized, that he noticed how she stayed late, how she listened to others before herself, and those words landed deep because they named the truth she hid, and for a moment she forgot to move, forgot to answer, caught between wanting to step away and wanting to stay still, and that confusion frightened her more than desire ever could. She answered him carefully, thanked him, tried to keep her voice light, yet her hands shook as she placed the last book on the shelf, and when she turned she saw something in his eyes, concern mixed with restraint, and he stepped back at once as if he sensed the danger of the moment, apologized for startling her, and left the room with quiet steps, but the space he had occupied felt charged, as if something unseen had brushed past her and changed the air. Rachel stood alone, heart racing, telling herself nothing had happened, because nothing had, yet she could not deny how alive she felt, how seen, and that realization made her chest ache with guilt and longing at the same time. And as she drove home through familiar streets she replayed the moment again and again, not because it was dramatic but because it was small and human, because it showed her how hungry she had been for simple recognition, and when she slipped into bed beside Mark, who was already asleep with his back turned, she stared into the dark and wondered how a life could look so stable from the outside and feel so fragile within, and she promised herself that this was just a passing feeling, that tomorrow everything would return to normal. Yet even as she made that promise she sensed the truth waiting quietly in her chest, that some moments do not fade, they settle, and once they do, nothing ever feels the same again. After that Sunday, Rachel tried to return to her routine, but the days moved faster and heavier, as if time itself was urging her forward before she could think, and she began to avoid empty hallways at church, arriving late and leaving early, yet somehow Pastor Daniel still appeared in ordinary moments. Near the bulletin board, by the side door, in passing glances that carried quiet understanding without a single word spoken, and this made everything harder because nothing improper was happening, nothing she could point to and say this is wrong, and still her chest tightened each time she sensed him nearby. At home, the gap between her and Mark felt wider, filled with short talks about bills and schedules, and Rachel noticed how often she stopped herself from sharing her thoughts because she had learned over years that his answers would be quick and distracted, not unkind but absent, and this absence followed her everywhere, turning small moments into long hours of reflection. So she stayed busy, volunteered more, cleaned more, smiled more, hoping effort could quiet the restless pull inside her. Daniel, for his part, remained careful, never seeking her out, yet when they spoke his words carried attention, asking how she was in a way that invited honesty, and Rachel answered with half-truths, saying she was fine while feeling everything but, and these conversations ended too soon, leaving her both relieved and unsettled, because she began to understand that the danger was not in what was said but in what was left unsaid. One evening after choir practice, she sat alone in the church parking lot as the sky darkened, unable to start the engine, her hands resting on the wheel as tears came without warning, not from desire but from exhaustion, from realizing how long she had carried her feelings alone, and she thought about how easily a few kind words had reached her, how little it had taken to make her feel noticed, and that scared her because it meant the weakness was already there long before Daniel ever stepped into her life. The following weeks blurred together with quick exchanges and quiet restraint, and Rachel found herself listening differently during sermons, hearing messages about temptation and honesty as if they were spoken directly to her, and each time Daniel spoke about responsibility she felt both comforted and challenged, because she could see the effort it took for him to remain distant, and that effort mirrored her own, forming a bond built not on closeness but on shared silence. At home, Mark missed small changes in her, the way she lingered before answering, the way she stayed awake longer at night. And Rachel grew frustrated not with him but with her own expectations, realizing she had never asked him to see her more deeply and had instead accepted the quiet space between them as normal. And now that space felt unbearable. One night, after a long day, she almost told him everything, opening her mouth to speak before fear closed it again, and she went to bed wondering when honesty had become so difficult. Days later, she crossed paths with Daniel near the office doorway, and their eyes met. Longer than necessary, not with longing but with recognition, and he nodded slightly as if acknowledging the struggle they both carried, and that simple moment brought her both strength and sorrow, because it confirmed that she was not alone in her confusion. Rachel began to pray differently, not for feelings to disappear but for clarity, asking for courage to face what her heart was revealing about her life, and as she did, she understood that infidelity does not always announce itself loudly. That sometimes it grows quietly through unmet needs and unspoken truths, and that awareness pushed her toward a choice she could no longer delay, because whether she turned away or faced forward, the cost of silence was becoming too high. And as she locked the church doors one evening and walked into the cool night air, she sensed that the fragile balance she was holding could not last much longer, and that soon she would have to decide which truth she was willing to live with. The storm hit suddenly, and Rachel didn't expect it, but the rain started in thick sheets just as choir practice ended, drumming on the roof and turning the streets slick and shiny, and she found herself hurrying toward the church office to wait it out, only to realize that Pastor Daniel was already there, checking the emergency lights and making sure the building was safe, and the room felt smaller than usual, shadowed and warm from the faint glow of the lights, the storm outside masking every other sound, leaving only the rhythm of water and their breathing. Daniel spoke first, carefully, asking if she was all right, and Rachel nodded, but the nod felt hollow because inside, her thoughts were spinning, and when he suggested they sit to wait out the storm, she found herself agreeing without thinking, and they sat opposite each other, the glow of the emergency lamp between them, and silence stretched longer than comfortable, the kind of silence that can reveal more than words, and Rachel felt every heartbeat, aware of the tension that had been building over weeks, months even, not from actions but from recognition, from the understanding that both of them were carrying unspoken weight. Daniel broke the quiet, his voice low and steady, admitting the truth he had kept inside, not a confession of wrongdoing but an honest acknowledgement of feelings he hadn't meant to develop, feelings of care, of admiration, and Rachel's chest tightened, because she knew she had felt the same stirrings in herself, emotions that were human, undeniable, but dangerous, and for a moment, the world outside ceased to exist, leaving only the room, the storm, and their shared awareness, and she realized the closeness of weeks past had led to this, a single moment where restraint was tested, where the heart whispered louder than reason. She spoke too, her voice trembling slightly, admitting that she had struggled with the loneliness that had crept into her life, that she had hungered for understanding and attention in ways that had nothing to do with desire but everything to do with being seen, and Daniel listened, eyes soft, nodding in quiet understanding, and for a moment, they leaned toward each other, not touching, not crossing any line, just drawn by a shared vulnerability. But Rachel pulled back, remembering everything that was at stake, remembering Mark, her life, the vows she had taken, and whispered firmly, "This can't happen, even here, even now," and Daniel agreed, his voice low, almost breaking, as he acknowledged the truth they both knew, that boundaries had to remain even if hearts were restless. The storm continued outside, rain pelting the windows, thunder rumbling faintly, and they both sat in silence again, the weight of what could have been pressing down on them, yet relief mingled with sorrow, because honesty had been spoken and limits had been honored, and Rachel left soon after, soaked from a brief dash to her car, feeling both hollow and lighter, carrying the heavy awareness that feelings can exist without crossing lines, and that truth, once faced, can be as painful as it is freeing. That night, she went home and had the hardest conversation of her life, not about Daniel specifically but about the emptiness that had settled in her marriage, about fear, isolation, and the need to reconnect, and Mark listened, shifting from fatigue to attentiveness as she poured out what she had carried quietly for years, and though it hurt, it was a beginning, the first real step toward repairing the distance that had grown silently between them. And as Rachel lay in bed that night, she realized that infidelity doesn't always begin with action. Sometimes it starts with loneliness, with words unsaid and hearts craving recognition, and that confronting it, facing it honestly, could be the only way to prevent a real betrayal. And she understood that even the most tempting moments could be resisted, even the strongest feelings could be acknowledged without crossing the line, and that restraint paired with honesty could heal the cracks she had been ignoring for far too long. Months passed, and life slowly shifted into a new rhythm, the kind that comes after storms when the air is clearer and quieter, and Rachel felt the subtle weight of relief mixed with lingering tension as she adjusted to the changes. Knowing that Pastor Daniel had requested a transfer to another church, leaving town without drama, without scandal, simply distance that both freed and haunted her, and she realized how much courage it had taken for him to step back, for both of them to acknowledge what had been stirring in their hearts without ever crossing the line, and that awareness made her reflect on her own life at home, where she and Mark had begun counseling, awkward and slow at first, each session filled with uncomfortable silences, hard truths, and sometimes tears, yet each conversation chipped away at the walls they had built around themselves, the emotional gaps that had widened over years of routine and distraction, and Rachel discovered that honesty, even when painful, could be transformative, that speaking fears aloud could create a bridge over loneliness, and that love, however strained, could be rebuilt with intention and care. She noticed small changes in Mark too, how he lingered a moment longer when speaking to her, how he asked questions and listened, really listened, and she felt a spark of connection she hadn't felt in years, realizing that the past months of inner struggle had awakened something dormant, something that could grow if nurtured, and she took responsibility for her own feelings, acknowledging the loneliness that had made her vulnerable, the quiet desire for recognition, and the way she had almost let it slip into dangerous territory. And she felt grateful that restraint and honesty had preserved her life and her marriage, because she knew how easily one small step could have led elsewhere. Sometimes, Rachel caught herself thinking of Daniel, not with longing but with understanding, remembering the stormy night, the quiet admissions, the closeness that had never been acted upon, and she realized it wasn't desire that had defined those moments, but the human need to be seen and acknowledged, the silent companionship of someone who understood her without judgment, and that recognition allowed her to forgive herself for the stirrings of her heart, to accept them as part of being human, without guilt or shame. Over time, Rachel and Mark rebuilt routines that included shared meals, honest conversations, and quiet moments of laughter, small gestures that reminded them of why they had fallen in love. And the process was slow, sometimes frustrating, often requiring patience and grace, yet it worked in ways that felt real and lasting, because it was grounded in truth, in mutual acknowledgement of past mistakes, and in the effort to grow together rather than apart. Rachel also learned to find satisfaction in her own company, to appreciate the quiet moments at church or in her home without waiting for external validation, to pray not for distractions but for clarity and strength, and in this, she found a deeper sense of peace than she had expected, understanding that fulfillment often comes from facing oneself honestly and nurturing what truly matters. As months turned into a year, the memory of Daniel's transfer remained a quiet echo, a reminder of what could have been and the choices they had made instead, and Rachel knew she would carry that memory not as regret but as a lesson, a testament to the power of restraint, honesty, and self-awareness, and she felt gratitude for the growth it had sparked within her and for the renewed connection with her husband, realizing that infidelity is not always physical, that emotional vulnerability can be just as dangerous. Yet when handled with integrity it can also become a catalyst for deeper love and understanding. Ultimately, Rachel understood that life is full of moments that test our hearts, that temptation and longing are part of being human, and that the way we respond to them shapes our relationships and ourselves. And she embraced the quiet strength she had found, the courage to confront difficult truths, the ability to nurture love that had almost slipped away, and the wisdom to recognize that sometimes the most meaningful connections are built not in moments of passion but in moments of honesty, patience, and emotional bravery, leaving her with a life that was not perfect, but real, and deeply her own, full of hope, care, and the quiet satisfaction of choices made with integrity.